"The stinking colored folks! Get in line! It's mealtime!" The shout rang out from behind the free food counter, tearing through the dreary gray afternoon in a filthy corner of the Bronx. Cracked hands shriveled in the cold, eyes didn't dare to lift. Everyone was used to being spoken to like animals. No one reacted. Except for one man, Dominic Carter stood at the end of the line, hair long and tangled, dust-covered beard, frayed-shouldered coat, and shoes with split toes. But what made him stand out, though no one noticed, was his gaze, not the look of a starving man, but a silent, cold stare, as if recording every detail, every speaker, every hateful glance, every mocking laugh. "Sit your stray dog ass down. Cut the line again, and you'll get the stick." The towering guard, in a white coat stained with tomato sauce, threw a warning baton toward Dominic, nearly hitting a child standing nearby. Dominic bent down, picked up the stick, said nothing, and placed it back at the man's feet. In his deep brown eyes flickered something that looked very much like pity. "You okay?" A gentle voice rang out, striking Dominic's ears like a springtime bell. He looked up. Standing before him was a young woman with her hair tied high and a flour-dusted apron, holding out a paper-wrapped sandwich. Her name was Elena. Elena was unlike anyone else at this shelter. She didn't look at the homeless with pity, but as if they were old friends, once shared a dinner table, once offered her a glass of wine at some simple supper. She remembered everyone's name, called them by their real names, not crazy old man, mute lady, or junkie. Dominic took the sandwich, nodding slightly in place of thanks. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked him in the eye, not because they were afraid of him, but because they never thought he was worth looking at. "What's your name?" Elena asked. Dominic looked up. He knew the risk of telling the truth, but those eyes, genuine, without hidden motive, made him hesitate. Then he smiled faintly. "Call me Dom." She smiled. "All right, Dom. If you want, come back tomorrow. I'll save you a bigger sandwich." That was the first time he felt warm after nearly a year living in a frozen hell. Dominic, or Dom as Elena called him, showed up every afternoon like clockwork. Just as the sunlight faded, and smoke from fast food joints began curling above the streets steeped in fumes and weariness. He didn't come for the food, nor for a thin blanket or a pair of worn-out shoes someone left behind. He came for Elena's gaze. That gaze wasn't naive, like those who still believed in justice in a broken world. It was a light both gentle and unyielding, as if no matter how much filth was thrown at her, she would still stand up and wipe the blood off her hands without complaint. In the tiny shelter that barely fit 3 people without bumping into one another, Elena sat among tin cans and expired food packages, telling him little stories about a boy named Tyron who got kicked out of class just for wearing torn sandals, about the ceiling fan in her attic apartment that creaked every night, forcing her to play Mozart to fall asleep, about an old lady who used to be a university professor but now slept under a bridge and still kept the habit of writing a diary in archaic French. "You know," she said once while folding paper napkins, "many people here used to be names in America's phone books. Then one day, they vanished from payrolls, address books, and tax files, not because they died, but because society simply stopped remembering them." Dom said nothing. He looked at Elena as if she had just read a page out of his own book. Elena had a habit of talking like the world still had hope, even when surrounded by indifferent eyes and trembling hands. She didn't need an audience. But Dominic listened. Every story Elena told peeled off another layer within him. Not the tattered coat of a wanderer, but the armor of pride, coldness, and calculation that Dominic Carter, former billionaire head of Cartex Biotech, had worn for over a decade. He had once delivered speeches to thousands of Ivy League students, advised 3 presidents, and stood on the Davos stage in a tailored suit worth $50,000. But now, his hands were scraping off chicken grease from the bottom of a soup pot, bending down to pick up dented milk cartons, and sitting cross-legged on a cold cement floor, folding used blankets before nightfall. No one recognized him, and strangely, he had never felt so free. One time, when only the 2 of them remained in the shelter, Elena handed him a kitchen towel, smiled softly, and said, "You might not believe me, but I studied organizational behavior. I know how to spot someone who once held power. You sit upright. You look at things like you're assessing how well they function." Dominic paused for a moment. "But what really caught my attention," she continued, "is that you've never bragged about anything. People who've had everything and still choose silence. They're the ones I trust." He looked at her for a long time. If anyone had ever made Dominic Carter want to take off all his masks without fear, it was the person standing in front of him, with soapy hands and a smile untouched by darkness. A cold gust swept through, lifting the plastic curtain at the door. Dominic pulled it back down, then stood there for a long while. Outside was a city where no one remembered anyone, but here, in a room full of mildew and sweat, he found something that years of power had never given him: someone who listened, and a reason to stay. The shelter was more crowded than usual today. The weather had begun to turn cold, and the first winter winds carried a dampness that cut the skin like a dull blade. Dominic sat curled up under the awning, holding a plastic cup filled with something so weak it barely deserved to be called coffee. But he didn't mind. His eyes were fixed on Elena, who was turning over crates of expired food, picking out what could still be used. Her hair was tied high, a red scarf, frayed at the edges, wrapped around her neck. Every movement was deliberate. There was nothing of charity in the way she worked, only a human being trying to save other human beings. That was why he came here every day. Not for food, not for shelter, but for her. Elena still knew nothing about his past, and she had never asked. That frightened Dominic more than any question could. "Dom," Elena called, cheerfully. "Want to help me carry some milk inside?" He nodded and stood up. His back ached from sleeping on concrete for days on end, but he didn't complain. He pushed open the rickety wooden door leading to the small storage room behind the shelter. The scent inside was a pungent mix of spoiled milk, rusted metal, and burnt plastic, something he once thought he'd never smell again. Inside, he organized the crates as instructed by Elena, even suggesting layout changes to improve the flow for the people lining up. She laughed. "You've got a talent for coordination." He just smiled. "Maybe I was a warehouse manager in a past life. Or a CEO," Elena said, half joking, half curious. Dominic paused for a beat, then nodded it off with a faint smile. And that was when he saw it. A paper bundle slipped out from between the old crates. Documents printed on Cartex Biotech letterhead. He dropped to his knees, heart pounding. It was a copy of a termination notice. The ink smudged from dampness, but the names were still legible. Stephen Harper, Clinical Technical Supervisor. Michelle Harper, Community Program Coordinator. He swallowed hard. They were Elena's parents. Reason for termination: non-compliance during internal charity fund restructuring. Below that, the signature of Calvin Monroe. Rage erupted inside Dominic. He remembered clearly. Stephen Harper had stood by him during the nerve grafting project. A man so honest, it bordered on naivete. Michelle had proposed the idea of deploying free diagnostic programs in rural areas, something Dominic had once taken pride in, and now they'd been fired for refusing to launder money for Calvin Nump. Impossible. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, stepping closer. Dominic clenched the paper in his hand, folded it quickly, and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Nothing. Just surprised to see company documents here. Elena gave a faint, sad smile. Oh, I picked up some stuff from a liquidation truck. They use company paper to wrap food sometimes. Nothing strange about that. He nodded, but his heart wouldn't stop racing. Each beat thudded like a countdown toward something bigger. That night, Dominic sat alone on the shelter's front steps. Elena had gone home. The city was soaked in the dim glow of streetlights and distant car horns. He pulled out an old phone, removed its casing, and extracted a tiny chip hidden inside, the only thing he had kept from his former life, inserting it into a basic handheld device. He accessed his high-security account Phoenix protocol. The screen flickered to life with a faded message. Account status suspended by Level 2 admin. Calvin Monroe. Dominic narrowed his eyes. Calvin had dared to freeze all his access rights. That meant the man truly believed Dominic would never return. But Dominic didn't need access. He needed a reason, and now he had one. The next morning, when Dominic arrived at the shelter, he saw Elena arguing with two men in black suits. One was a food safety officer. The other represented a new charity organization, one Elena had previously applied to for community center funding. You misused the grant, one of them said coldly. You distributed expired food without certified documentation, and you used the label Community Center for a facility that hasn't been officially licensed. Elena trembled. I never kept a single dollar for myself. You can check. Oh, we will. For now, this place is to be shut down pending investigation. Dominic stepped forward, placing himself between them. Do you have a warrant? He asked, his voice deep and calm. And who are you, a witness? And if you're following the law, I assume you won't mind me recording this interaction. The two men exchanged glances, a moment of hesitation. Then they backed off, leaving Elena collapsed on the ground, hands clutching her head. Dominic said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder so lightly, it barely touched her. Elena didn't look at him. She only whispered, I don't know why. Everything keeps falling apart. My parents got fired. Now it's me. I just wanted to do the right thing. Dominic looked at her, and he understood. She didn't need a wealthy man to come save her. She needed justice. And he would start by taking back what had been stolen from her. Not with money, but with the very mask the world once forced him to wear. 3 days later, a card was dropped into the torn mailbox at the corner of the block, where Dominic often stopped by to dig out old newspapers to read. It had no envelope, just a thick sheet of embossed paper. You are cordially invited. An evening honoring entrepreneurs for community service. Calvin Monroe, a national humanitarian icon. Hilton Manhattan Grand Hotel. Saturday, 7:00 p.m. Dominic skimmed it, his brows tightening. A part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Another part remained still, like a windless lake at midnight. A man who climbed to gold-plated pedestals by stepping over thousands of lives. Now being honored for humanity, and the award presented by none other than the media system once funded by Cartex. At the bottom of the card, a smaller line read, Special Guests, Community and Media Representatives. An opportunity, a stage, and perhaps a velvet-wrapped dagger. Dominic folded the card and slipped it into the pocket of his tattered coat. He had once been part of that world dazzling, glittering, where every stab in the back was called strategy. This time, he would return, but not as someone welcomed. Saturday evening, crystal lights shimmered across the Hilton Hotel lobby ceiling like they were mocking everyone below. Pressed suits, form-fitting gowns, expensive cologne and wine mingled into the familiar stench of artificial grace that Dominic remembered all too well. He didn't go through the front entrance, didn't walk the red carpet. No cameras turned when he passed through the service hallway, dressed in a borrowed waiter's uniform from an old Cartex chef. one of the few who still remembered him, though now his hair had turned snowy white. "Are you sure about this?" the chef asked, hands trembling as he tied the apron string behind him. "More sure than I've ever been," Dominic answered, his voice low and glowing like coal, simmering in an old fire. "I just want to see him, standing under the lights, not knowing someone's already digging his grave behind the curtain." The hall was packed. The overture playing in the background was Beethoven's Symphony No. 7. Its grandeur felt theatrically hollow. Dominic pushed a cart of wine quietly between the banquet tables, head bowed, shoulders slightly hunched. No one noticed. And then he stepped up, Calvin Monroe in a glossy black tuxedo. His smile carved like it had been shaped with a surgical scalpel, stood on stage behind a gold-plated microphone. Each step he took was as if he were walking on white bones he'd never bothered to look down at. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming like a theater actor's, "I've known loss, I've been hurt by misplaced trust, but I rose again not for power, but for the community, for the forgotten souls." Applause echoed on cue. A few guests even rose to cheer. Dominic stood backstage, near where desserts were being prepped, in his hand, a tray of wine and a tiny device the size of 2 fingers, an encrypted Bluetooth transmitter. It could activate the recording at just the right moment. He clipped the device to the stage's audio system. It was still the old setup, one Dominic had designed 5 years ago, and like everything he ever built, he always left a back door, on stage. Calvin began telling a fabricated, sentimental story. "A year ago, I had to save our company from collapse after the founder abandoned us." A scoff came from the back rows. Calvin pressed on. "We have proven that humanity triumphs over any shadow." Dominic pressed the button. A voice rang out not from Calvin's mic, but from the hall's audio system itself. "Homeless people are parasites. If I had the power, I'd wipe them off the map. Every meal they eat is a stab in the taxpayer's wallet." Silence. A deadly kind of silence. Calvin's face froze. First confusion, then panic. The crowd murmured. The MC looked rattled. Someone yelled. "What the hell was that? A second recording played, Humanitarian Award. Just hand it to me. I'll throw in a few million. Give them some orphaned black kids for photo ops. The press will eat it up like dogs." Chairs scraped, cameras swung. Calvin lunged toward the mic. "It's fake, doctored audio." Dominic stepped out. The server uniform was gone. He wore his old black leather jacket, and his face has no need for introduction. Everyone had seen it on the cover of Forbes, in the Wall Street Journal, and in Kardec's own promotional films praising him as a visionary. The room held its breath. Dominic took the mic. "Hello, Calvin? Looks like your party's a bit crowded tonight, but I still have one last dessert I forgot to serve." Calvin stood frozen. The spotlight caught every bead of sweat on his face. Dominic turned to the crowd. "And as for all of you, if anyone here ever put their trust in the name Calvin Monroe, I'd ask you to stay just a few more minutes. I think you deserve to know exactly what you've been fed." His eyes swept across stunned faces. From the front row, a young journalist gasped, "Oh my God, that's Dominic Carter." No one in the hall moved. The room suddenly felt too small, too silent, as if all the sound had been drained from the air. Calvin stood frozen, still clutching the microphone, but no words came out. Dominic looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, only with a silence so crushing. It felt like a verdict from the highest court. "You weren't going to do this," Calvin stammered, his voice hoarse, as if being squeezed. Dominic stepped forward. Each step of his worn-out shoes on the marble floor echoed like a hammer sealing a coffin. He took the still live microphone and turned to face the audience. "Tonight isn't about me," he said, voice deep, clear, and commanding. It's about the people who were cast out of the system, the ones silenced, labeled as burdens, branded as losers, and sold out in the name of greed disguised as compassion. A click echoed. The massive LED screen behind Calvin lit up, displaying a set of financial charts from Cartex, but not the ones the public had ever seen. This is the original data from Cartex's internal finance system, Dominic continued, before it was adjusted and rationalized under the hands of Vice President Calvin Monroe. On screen, numbers appeared, budget lines mysteriously slashed, a line item labeled Community Support Fund had been reduced by 87% in just 6 months. Meanwhile, media relations spending had quadrupled. At the bottom, a trail of transactions leading to a shell company, Silverpath Consulting LLC, under the name of a woman, an ex-lover of Calvin. The room exploded with murmurs. Cameras panned in every direction. People stood up, removing translation headsets. From the front row, an elderly shareholder growled, "Is this real?" Calvin tried to step toward the mic. Dominic raised a hand to stop him. "Don't worry," he said, calmly. "I'm not finished yet." The wings opened. A young woman stepped in, brown hair tied up high, slender figure, but eyes like cold steel. Dominic introduced, "This is Anna Blake, former senior assistant to Calvin Monroe, the one who used to work under direct supervision until she was fired for refusing to destroy documents." Anna nodded to the auditorium, her hand trembling as she held the microphone. "I used to trust him," she began, her voice hesitant. "I thought I was doing the right thing, helping the company restructure, cut costs, and optimize performance. But then I discovered records being altered, emails disappearing, and a hidden money transfer order sent to a fund in the Cayman Islands under the name of an 8-year-old child he claimed was his nephew." The entire auditorium erupted. Dominic didn't stop. He gestured. A legal staff member stepped up, presenting a notarized copy of the technology transfer contract. The Cartex patent, sold by Calvin to a foreign corporation for only 1/5 of its actual value. "This," Dominic said, "is the reason why Elena Harper's parents, who used to be directors of the community program, were fired. They discovered and opposed this deal, and that's also the reason Elena herself is now under investigation. Because Calvin needs to eliminate all connections." Someone started shouting in the corner of the hall. A group of journalists stood up simultaneously, snapping photos non-stop. Calvin tried to interject, screaming, "You're a deserter. You abandoned the company. You're insane." Dominic smirked. "You're right," he replied. "I walked away. Because I foolishly believed that the people I trusted would uphold ethics in my absence." He paused for a moment, then said slowly, "But now I'm back. Not to reclaim power, but to reclaim what's right." At the entrance area, a group of people quietly walked in. Among them, a man in a gray suit wearing a federal prosecutor's office badge. He walked straight onto the stage, holding out a warrant. "Mr. Calvin Monroe," the prosecutor said, "you are under preliminary investigation for financial fraud, cross-border money laundering, and abuse of power in a non-profit organization." No one clapped. No one cheered. Only Calvin stood frozen, face pale, sweat beading on his temple. You can't do this. This isn't your way," he stammered. Dominic looked straight into his eyes. "You don't know who I am anymore. Calvin, I'm no longer the man you once betrayed. And I didn't come here to win. I came to remind you of one thing." Dominic turned to the crowd. "That there are people who, only after losing everything, truly become those who cannot be controlled." The sound of the microphone dropping onto the table echoed like a full stop, and everything was only just beginning. The news broke out like a silent explosion spreading across television channels within minutes after Dominic left the hotel. Missing billionaire Dominic Carter returns. Overthrow during an honorary ceremony. Calvin Monroe under investigation. The sensational headlines quickly dominated all search bars. But Dominic didn't care about that. He was sitting in a small corner cafe, wearing his tattered coat again, sipping diluted coffee and waiting for the right person. "You're early," a female voice spoke up behind him. He didn't turn around. "I don't have much time left to be late anymore." Elena pulled out a chair, sat down opposite him. She wore an old wide-sleeved shirt, her hair tied neatly, no makeup. But her gaze, sharp as a blade. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "About everything." Dominic set the coffee cup down. "Because I needed to know if I was still someone worth trusting when I had nothing left." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "So what? Now you've proven you still have power." "And then what?" "Go back to the office, sign a few hundred more contracts." Dominic gave a faint smile. "I'm not going back to the office. I'm going back to burn it down." 3 days later, the Cartex headquarters building, symbol of American biotechnology, was completely sealed off. Dominic appeared at exactly 800 a.m., unannounced, without bodyguards, without press, only the silence of a man who knows he doesn't need anyone to follow. The security staff were bewildered, but no one dared stop him. Only one person stepped forward: Lauren, his former secretary, who had stood beside Calvin when Dominic disappeared. "It's really you," she whispered. Dominic nodded. His gaze held no blame. "Lauren, I need all original backup data from last year. Is the Phoenix system code still active?" She was silent for a moment, then handed him a USB drive. "There's only one copy. I didn't dare delete it, because I didn't want to be part of that game." Dominic gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you. Not for loyalty, but for still knowing fear." Meeting room on the 33rd floor. Once the domain of Calvin Monroe, now resembled a closed courtroom. No gavel, no judge, but all eyes were fixed on the man who had just taken the seat at the head of the table. Mr. Carter, a silver-haired shareholder, spoke up. "The stock is dropping sharply. The market is losing confidence. We need immediate direction." Dominic placed a dossier on the table, opened each page slowly, as if peeling off layers of his own company's mask. "This is the full evidence showing that over the past 9 months, Calvin Monroe secretly sold our technology to 3 foreign entities, concealed by legitimizing it through a charitable foundation. In return, he personally profited nearly $40 million. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Another executive gasped, flipped his phone to check. The stock had dropped 12% in just 4 hours. "We need a recovery plan, a face to reassure the market," the silver-haired man continued. Dominic looked up. "Not me." The room fell silent. No one needs a man who once vanished from the leadership seat in the dark of night, then returned like a hero. What this company needs is not an old name, but a new core. He stood up, pulling out a signed declaration. "I will withdraw all my shares. But before that, I have transferred 65% of my holdings into a nonprofit fund called the Phoenix Restoration Fund. Mission to protect employees unlawfully terminated, support public health care, and conduct independent investigations into misconduct in the pharmaceutical industry." No one could speak, a turn no one anticipated, a victory not to reclaim the throne, but to destroy it. At the same time, in a small hospital in the Bronx, Elena was tidying up the free clinic she had once dreamed of building. The door opened. A man in a simple suit stepped in, carrying a suitcase. "Miss Elena Harper, that's me." He placed the suitcase down. "This is an emergency grant from the Phoenix Restoration Fund, along with 5 years of free licensing for neural tissue testing technology once owned by Cartex. Elena was stunned. She couldn't speak. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the suitcase. Inside were legal documents, equipment licenses, technology transfer papers, everything she had ever dreamed of, yet thought she could never reach, and a handwritten letter, written in bold but slightly trembling strokes. I can't give you an answer about love, but I can give you justice. D.C. Elena sat still. Her eyes were red, but not a single tear fell. Instead, she stood up, walked to the door, and flipped up the old sign, open. Free for everyone. We'll start again, she said softly. From where you left off. That evening, an exclusive article was published on the front page of the New York Herald. Billionaire Dominic Carter refuses to return as CEO. Statement. I won't let those once cast out have to knock twice. Below was a photo of Dominic standing in front of the Bronx relief station, where he had once washed dishes and mopped floors, this time in simple clothes and beside a small donation box with a handwritten sign, "We have been at the bottom." Can someone once abandoned by the world become the one to lift up an entire forgotten generation? The answer was in the eyes of those who returned to the relief station that day, when they saw Dominic not standing on any high platform, but sitting cross-legged on the ground, teaching a child to write their first letter on the old cement floor. Monday morning, the New York Stock Exchange opened in chaos not seen since the regional bank chain collapse 4 years ago. Cartex shares, after Dominic's speech refusing to take over, did not plunge as expected. Instead, they stood still, a dangerous stillness. The silence of the market is more terrifying than bad news, because it means everyone is waiting for something bigger, more serious, from a place no one can pinpoint. And it began with an anonymous email sent to dozens of investigative journalists and corporate ethics foundations at 8:32 a.m., just one line, tonight. The full truth about the Monroe Humanitarian Fund will be revealed. Tune in to FBN at 9 p.m. No one knew who the sender was, but everyone guessed Dominic was not finished. By evening, Dominic was sitting in a dimly lit room, inside the former headquarters of a blockchain tech startup, which he had quietly acquired 2 years ago as an emergency backup location. Soundproof walls, servers running 24/7, a large central screen scrolling through code scanning offshore banking data from tax havens. On the table was a contract, the transfer of the entire investigative dataset to an international human rights organization with an office in Washington. Dominic had signed, but he hadn't sent it yet. Across the table, Anna Blake, Calvin's former assistant, sat with her eyes fixed on the laptop. Triple authentication, the code from Cayman matches. The alias account under Calvin transferred $2.8 million into the personal account of the head of the charity tied to Monroe Foundation, she said, voice sharp as steel. Dominic nodded. Enough to peel the mask. You still plan to release it publicly? Anna asked. No, he replied. I'll let the media break it. You don't want your name on it. No, I just want the truth to exist. It doesn't need a storyteller. 9 p.m. The FBN screen lit up. An exclusive video was broadcast footage of Calvin Monroe in a closed-door meeting, speaking to donors about the plan to withdraw medical aid funds from inefficient Black communities in order to focus on areas with higher media profitability. The video was secretly recorded. The quality wasn't great, but the audio was crystal clear. And at the end of the video, Calvin said, and Dominic, trust me, he doesn't have the guts to come back. He's just a shadow wearing a humanitarian mask now. The internet exploded. Twitter X was flooded with hashtags like #DominicIsBack, #Justice Without Fame, #CalvinGate. Mainstream media simultaneously released headlines. CNN, CNBC, The Guardian. City Hall opened an internal investigation. Formerly fired employees began to speak out. Posts once thought deleted suddenly reappeared as if someone was silently pulling all scattered clues into a complete picture. And Calvin remained silent. So silent, it was frightening. To the point that even his lawyers quietly began to withdraw from the case. In the mansion on the outskirts of Westchester. He smashed his fourth wine glass, yelling into a phone that no one answered. The assistants had vanished since the afternoon. His computer was remotely locked, and all his Swiss accounts suddenly frozen. Dominic, he whispered, wine dripping from his lips. You dare. The next morning, a silver-gray car stopped in front of the Bronx relief station. Dominic stepped out, not wearing a suit, no sunglasses, no designer coat, just himself, the man carrying thousands of secrets, and a laptop ready for the final live stream unveiling the last part of the crime chain. But as he stepped in, Elena was already there. She didn't smile, nor was she angry. She just looked at him for a long time, then said, "You're going very far now, Dominic." "So far? I don't know if you'll ever be able to stop." He looked at her. Elena's eyes were no longer the innocent ones from before, but the gaze of someone who once believed she could save the world, only to realize she now had to save the one carrying that burden. "I need to finish this," Dominic said. Elena gently shook her head. "You think justice comes from exposing all the truth? No." He exhaled. "I think justice comes from making sure no one else has to endure what I did." A moment of silence, but within it was a lifetime of reflection. They stood still, no embrace, no hands touching hands. But something had changed not only in Dominic, but in Elena too. She was no longer the girl handing out bread. She had become a living witness to a moral earthquake where people not only reclaimed justice, but learned how to pass it on. The temporary stage set up at the shelter was just a small wooden platform, with a handwritten sign behind it. The truth doesn't need a subscription. It needs to be heard. No stage lights, no television coverage. But it was the place where all eyes from around the world were watching via live stream. Dominic stepped up. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't talk about Calvin. He didn't mention data. He didn't speak of victory. He told a story about a man who was once cast out of the very world he had helped create. A man who once stood on the sidelines, watching others receive applause for stealing his work. And one day, that man came back, not for revenge, but to make sure no one else would have to repeat his story. "I'm not a hero," Dominic said, his voice slow and steady. "I'm just someone who used to stay silent. And today, I choose to stay silent no longer." A child sitting nearby burst into tears. No one said a word, but everyone stood up, not for fame, but because they knew that finally, someone had chosen to stand on their side. That very night, Calvin was arrested while trying to leave the international airport using a fake passport. The video went viral across the internet, capturing the moment he was handcuffed, head bowed low. And for the first time, he had no words left to say. In his hand, his phone was still open with an article the man the world forgot, just gave it the most unforgettable lesson. Right before being taken into the police car, Calvin looked up one last time, eyes dazed, as if trying to find someone among the crowd, and then he saw a man standing far beyond the barricade. That man didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't say a word. He just stood there, a living reminder that silence is never the final option. At the Manhattan South Detention Center, Calvin Monroe sat alone in cell number 214, the flickering fluorescent light overhead reflected onto his face, a face once printed on the covers of business magazines as a symbol of modern leadership. Now, Calvin's gaze was as empty as a winter lake, eerily still, because there was nothing left to lose. His official lawyer, had declined representation. 3 board members who had once signed the vote of absolute confidence had now all publicly distanced themselves. Even his legal wife had emailed the court office, declaring she would fully cooperate with the investigation. And Dominic never spoke. That silence killed Calvin, hour by hour. 1 week later, all assets under Calvin's name, including real estate, stocks, and trusts were frozen. The affiliated charitable organizations were successively audited, and a series of indictments were announced, including financial fraud, misuse of charitable funds, bribery of the media, concealing income in tax havens, obstruction of federal investigation. Each charge was a cut into the moral facade that Calvin had meticulously painted. In a closed hearing, when asked to say a word in his defense, Calvin uttered only 4 words, voice hoarse. It was a mistake. The judge asked nothing more. The hearing concluded within 10 minutes, but the most notable part wasn't inside the courtroom. It was in the hallway outside, where hundreds of people who had been indirect victims of him were waiting. A woman held up a sign, "I lost my husband because we couldn't afford medicine." He called it cost-cutting. A man next to her, "My son died because he wasn't approved for neural tissue transplant." Cartex cut funding after Calvin took over. And in the middle of the crowd, Elena, she didn't hold a sign. She didn't chant slogans. She just stood there, quietly, not for revenge, but to witness an ending. At the same time, Dominic withdrew from all interviews, declined every speaking engagement. He disappeared from the media radar a second time, but this time, no one called him a fugitive, because he had left behind a system that spoke in place of words within just 1 month. Phoenix Restoration Fund had helped rehire over 200 employees who were previously fired by Calvin, reestablished public health care programs in 8 regions that had lost funding, partnered with an international investigative organization to trace the entire money laundering network in the pharmaceutical industry from a single personal name. Dominic Carter became a model where silence was no longer an option and power was no longer the tool of a single man. One weekend afternoon, Dominic returned to the relief station in Bronx. He didn't announce his visit. The door was still old. The familiar musty smell lingered. But inside, everything had changed. The walls were repainted in a creamy white. New floors, proper food shelves. A wooden sign read, "Elena Harper, Community Recovery Center." Dominic stood for a long time in front of that sign. His hand gently touched the old cracks he had once patched with tape years ago. He smiled. A smile without pride, without victory, only relief. From the small room, Elena stepped out. She wore a white lab coat, her hair neatly tied up, holding a stack of papers in her hands. "You came without a message," she said. "I no longer want anyone to have to prepare for my presence." Dominic replied, soft as a breath. They looked at each other. No explanation needed, no questions asked. Elena set the papers down, grabbed a plastic chair, and pulled it out for him to sit. "What do you want to do today?" she asked. He looked over at the row of children sitting and learning math in the corner of the room. "I want to help check their work," he said, then laughed. "If I still remember how to divide fractions." Elena laughed along. "Then let's start over from 3rd grade, shall we?" That night, Dominic didn't return to the Manhattan penthouse. He slept at the station, on the old bunk bed that once belonged to Tyron, the boy Elena used to tell him about during those early days. Streetlight shone through the window crack, casting light on the wall where someone had written in black marker, "When people have nothing left to lose, they begin to give the most." Dominic rested his head on his arm, eyes looking up at the ceiling. It had been a long time since he last slept in a place without double locks. No security cameras, no air filters, only the sound of a ceiling fan and the steady breathing of people once labeled as burdens of society. And he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. And Calvin, he collapsed not in prison, but in the memory of the world. No one mentioned his name again. No one visited. No one wrote a biography. Even Wikipedia had only one single line: Calvin Monroe. Former vice president of Cartex, convicted in 2025. A full stop, no ellipsis, no next paragraph, a fate. No one wanted to remember. 2 months had passed since the day Calvin was sentenced. The Bronx relief station was no longer a temporary stop. It had become a true community center, with daytime classes, evening clinics, and a kitchen open 24 hours. There. Dominic was no longer the mysterious man with a powerful past. He was Uncle Dom, the one who always knew how to slice bread just right, who knew every child's name, who could predict rain just by the smell of damp earth in the morning. He no longer wore a watch, didn't use email, didn't read the news, didn't answer reporters knocking on the door. Everything he needed was right here. "Do you know which kid hid the purple chalk?" Elena asked, hands on her hips, as she stood in the makeshift classroom built of plywood and pull-down curtains. "Might be Tyron." Dominic replied, "He has a thing for collecting stuff nobody else thinks is necessary." "Like adults' opinions?" "Exactly." He grinned, raising an eyebrow. Elena sighed, but couldn't hide the smile that passed over her lips. Days like this. Simple, bustling, humble were something she had never dared to dream of when she used to run all over the city, seeking funding for community health projects that kept getting rejected. Her dream no longer lived in budget reports, but in the laughter of children and in the evenings spent cooking porridge with Dominic under the dim fluorescent light. One afternoon, just after the first spring rain had ended, Elena and Dominic sat together on the front steps of the shelter. The pavement was still wet. The scent of earth and soap drifted into the air. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Regret what? Not going back?" Dominic looked up at the slow drifting gray clouds. He hesitated for a moment, then answered, slowly, back when I was at the top. "Every morning, I woke up feeling like I had to prove I wasn't wrong, Elena. Now I wake up, and I just need to remember that yesterday I didn't wrong anyone." She nodded. "Sounds a little lonely." He smiled softly, better than living in a crowd and having to pretend. They sat in silence for a while. Then Elena turned to him. "I have a question. What is it? The letter, the other day. You wrote, 'I can't give you an answer about love.'" "Yeah." And now Dominic turned to look at her. For the first time in weeks, his eyes were deep like a night lake, unguarded, unafraid. "Now, I don't need the question anymore, say." Elena looked at him, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. Then she burst out laughing. "That's the worst answer for someone who was expecting more. But it's the only one I'm not saying to be forgiven, or to keep someone close," Dominic said. "I just wanted to be honest." Elena looked away, fingers fiddling with the old rubber ring on her pinky. "Maybe being honest is enough," she whispered. That evening, while Dominic was wiping down tables in the kitchen, Tyron ran in with a small slip of paper. "Someone sent this for you." "Uncle," the handsome white guy in the suit. From this morning, Dominic opened the note. There was only one line: "Carter. We know you don't want to come back, but we need someone to design the reintegration center model in Chicago. No title required, just need you to show up." Below was the signature of an independent nonprofit health organization. No ties to Cartex, no ties to Calvin. Completely new. Elena walked in. "Who was it?" Dominic looked at her. "It's the past calling again, but not to collect a debt. Just to ask if I still have something left to build." She didn't respond immediately. She quietly placed her hand on the table, close to his, Then, if you go this time, I'm going with you. Dominic looked up. Are you sure? No. She smiled. But I'm tired of watching others leave while I stay behind. A week later, Dominic and Elena left the Bronx. There was no grand farewell, just a few awkward hugs, a slightly burnt pie, and a child handing him a piece of purple chalk. So, you remember Bronx is where no one needs to be perfect, Tyron said. Dominic held the chalk tightly in his hand. I won't forget, he promised. As the car pulled out of the neighborhood, Elena looked back through the fogged-up window. Where are we going? Dominic kept his eyes on the road ahead. To a place where people like us can turn to pain into something that can live. Elena nodded. And if we fail, then we come back, Dominic said, but not empty-handed. We'll come back with a heart no longer afraid. In the back seat, a small notebook had fallen open. Scrawled inside was a line of messy handwriting. Not every love needs a lightning strike. Sometimes it just takes two people to be patient enough to wait for each other to take off all the masks. 1 year later, Chicago welcomed spring with skin-cutting cold winds and late-blooming cherry blossoms. On the old lot that once held an abandoned warehouse, now stood a rising structure, a sleek concrete campus. Solar-paneled rooftops, large glass windows overlooking the park. A sign was hung at the gate. Under the trembling hands of young Tyron, who had been invited to the inauguration Second Sight Foundation, where the forgotten will be seen again, inside. Hundreds of attendees fell silent as Dominic Carter stepped onto the stage. No orchestra, no lighting effects, only the sound of wind weaving through the rows of chairs. We built this place not to bestow charity, he began, but to open doors. Doors that were once shut in front of me, in front of you, and in front of millions who were judged simply because they no longer had a place to belong. Applause rose, but Dominic raised his hand to stop it. He smiled. Don't clap for me. I didn't come here as a founder. I came here as someone who once begged to sleep behind a hospital dumpster. The room fell completely silent, and today, I just want one more homeless person, someone still wandering out there, to know a door is already open for you. After the ceremony, Dominic walked toward the backyard. There, he and Elena had built a small garden. Those who had survived the system, unemployed, formerly incarcerated. Homeless came together to plant, brew tea, and share stories. No one asked what the other used to do. They only cared what they could help with today. An old man, missing a leg, once a NASA engineer, was installing solar batteries for the streetlights in the camp. A single mother was teaching local children how to mix paint and tell fairy tales. A young man who once went to juvenile detention for stealing bread now managed the food pantry. And Dominic, once the owner of the largest biotech corporation in America, was teaching little Tyron how to mix soil for vegetable beds. Elena walked over, holding a list of tomorrow's schedule. The UN delegation will be visiting at 9, she said. Dominic nodded, still untangling plant roots, and after that, the meeting with the healthcare donor group. Do you want me to come with you? No. You should stay here. Tyron needs help checking the reading class. Elena looked at him for a moment. Aren't you tired? Dominic looked up and smiled. Yes. But at least, this kind of tired doesn't make me feel ashamed. That evening, as the porch light shone down on the small wooden cabin behind the center, Dominic opened his old notebook. The first page still bore the messy handwriting, "Justice is not punishment. It's giving back a chance to someone it was taken from." He added a new line, "And love is not finding someone perfect. It's finding someone who stays when you have nothing left." He closed the notebook, stood up, and walked outside, where Elena was sitting and reading. Can we stop by the Bronx tomorrow? He asked. She looked surprised. Why? Tyron messaged. The shelter just held its first class without needing any outside aid. The kids want to give you a fourth-grade graduation gift. Elena laughed and nodded. 1 year later, the name Dominic Carter reappeared on the list of the 50 most influential people in the world, but this time not under CEO, but under architect of social justice reintegration systems. A journalist once asked him if you could start over. What would you do differently? Dominic simply replied, I'd start by washing dishes, instead of writing an IPO plan. No one called him the missing billionaire anymore. No one called Calvin a business icon. And no one called the homeless useless. Because one man who had once held all three labels proved that there is no permanent identity, only the daily choice to live with kindness.